Okay, hello everybody. This podcast is about the Nazi economy, 1933 to 39. The purpose of this podcast is to just really focus on making sure that you understand the basic principles that sit behind the details. There will be details. I would recommend that you pause the podcast to read what's on the screen and then listen to my explanation, because my explanation will not go through all of the points on the screen. To understand the Nazi economy in the 1930s, it's important just to understand the key aspects of foreign policy, because in the end the Nazi economy was serving Hitler's foreign policy objectives, and therefore the economy and foreign policy were closely interlinked. Have a look at the map. The key, the way I'm going to talk you through this is, first of all, what Hitler wanted and what he did not want. Okay, and there are four sort of key points on this. First of all, Hitler did want war, eventually. The type of war he wanted was a war in the East for living space. In other words, taking land from the east of Poland and from the Soviet Union. Land that was not populated by German people. No doubt about that. Hitler's objectives were about basically conquering vast amounts of territory so the German people had the space that he believed they deserved to live in because of his racial ideas, that the German people were a superior race, the Aryan race, who had the right to land that belonged to inferior races, in particular the Slavs in the East. That's the first point. Hitler did want war, but eventually. You'll notice that I've said there on the slide, at some point in the mid-40s, Germany certainly was not ready to launch that war in 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Secondly, what Hitler did not want, he did not want war soon. Straight away. The reason, Germany in 1933 was a country that had been wrecked by 4 years of the Great Depression. 6 million Germans were unemployed. The German army had been restricted in size by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was not ready to fight a huge war for living space in the East. If Germany did launch a war too soon, remember, Germany was restricted by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was imposed on Germany by the British, the French and the Americans. Germany would be at war with those three countries, and so Germany would be at war in the West, a war that Germany would lose. So that leads to the third point. Again, what did Hitler not want? Hitler did not want a war in the West. What he wanted was a war in the East, eventually. If Hitler were to misplay his foreign policy and end up fighting a war in the West against Britain, France and America, then Germany would be caught where Germany had been in World War I, fighting a war in two directions, in the East against Russia and in the West against Britain, France and America. Hitler's great learning point, virtually everything he did was based on the principle that Germany must not repeat the experience of World War I, that Germany could not fight a war on two fronts because that would involve dividing Germany's strength in two directions and would put too much of a burden on the German economy. Okay, so there are 3 points there. Hitler did want war, eventually. Hitler did not want war in the short term. Hitler did not want war in the West. Next point, the fourth point, Hitler did want to incorporate Austria, Czechoslovakia and the western part of Poland into Germany. Just to highlight where those were, Austria was German speaking. Hitler himself was an Austrian. Many Austrian people wanted Austria to be part of Germany. Go back to the 1870s, Bismarck had deliberately made the choice not to incorporate Austria into Germany, largely because it would cause international tensions. But from Hitler's point of view, he felt he had a just reason, a just argument to include Austria as part of Germany. Secondly, Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was a new country created after World War I, but the border region of Czechoslovakia, just zooming in, the border region, which I'm going to just highlight here, around the edge, that region, the region of Czechoslovakia that bordered onto Germany, called the Sudetenland, was populated with German-speaking people. 3 million or so, and those German-speaking people, many of them, believed that their land should be part of Germany. And again, that had been prevented by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, as indeed a union between Austria and Germany had been prevented by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And the third area is what we call the Polish corridor, which again I'm just shading in here. And when, like Czechoslovakia, Poland was a newly created country in 1919. And when that country was created, the borders were not created perfectly. And what was called the Polish corridor was a strip of Poland that literally split Germany into two. As you can see there, it was called the corridor. Population was mixed. There were many Poles living in that area, but there were also many Germans living in that area. So, pulling back to look at the whole map. Those were Hitler's claims. He did want war eventually. He did not want war soon. Hitler did not want war in the West, and he did want to incorporate the German-speaking parts of Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland into Germany. The final point is what Hitler claimed that he wanted, and there's a difference between Hitler wanted and what he actually said that he wanted, and this returns to the point about Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland. Hitler claimed that Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland were rightfully German because they were German speaking. And because they were rightfully German, he claimed the Treaty of Versailles, which had forbidden Austria and the Sudetenland and the Polish corridor to be included in Germany. He claimed that the Treaty of Versailles needed to be revised. And so Hitler's objective in the 1930s was to bring about a revision of the Treaty of Versailles. That meant he had to go into conflict with the British, French and the Americans because they imposed the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. But the type of conflict that Hitler wanted was a conflict over the conference table. Hitler did not want to go to war to incorporate those territories into Germany. So the reason Hitler claimed he wanted those territories was because of what we call revisionism. That's his claim. The reality, though, is that was not the reason he wanted to include those territories in Germany. The reason he wanted to include those territories into Germany, pull back, is because, look at the big picture, they are stepping stones towards the invasion of the Soviet Union. If, just change the colour of the pen here, if those areas, if Austria, sorry, I'm just messing around with the pen here. If those areas, Austria, were to be included, and the western part of Czechoslovakia And then if Poland were to be included, or the German-speaking parts of Poland were to be included into Germany, what's happened to Germany's frontier? Germany's frontier has moved further east. That therefore puts Germany into a better position to launch the big invasion of the Soviet Union for living space at a later stage, when that stage will arrive, presumably at some point in the 1940s. Okay, that's that particular contextual point. Let's move on to the next slide, which is about Hitler's aims. Okay, so the Nazi economy clearly sits as part of that issue of foreign policy. What are the key points you need to understand about Hitler's aims? It comes back to what we said earlier about World War I. Hitler was not particularly interested in the economy, and that point is made here. Little interest in or understanding of economics. He did not have a coherent plan, but what he did know is he knew enough about the economy to know that that it was important that in preparing for war there'd be no repetition of what happened in World War I, in particular having to fight on the two fronts. That was essential. A second one, which isn't directly stated there, but obviously remember in World War I, Germany had been blockaded by Britain. Germany had been starved out of the war. Although it's a complex issue, and I don't want to make it too simplistic, obviously one of the key reasons for Germany's defeat was not a military reason. It was basically about a collapse of morale on the home front back in Germany, because there was a shortage of essential goods. And the German people were unhappy. So as we move through this video cast, keep that point in mind. Hitler somehow needed to prepare for war, but it was important that he keep the people happy in Germany, that he did not put too much pressure economically on the home front. And what that basically meant is he needed to be able to provide the German people with consumer goods. As far as there's a plan, as you can see, it consisted of two stages, and try to view economic policy in the same sort of like way we've looked at other aspects of Germany's policy. Good way to think of it is stage one, the early years, sort of what we now see as up to about 1937. Hitler is putting on that sort of front of being a reasonable leader. He can't take risks. His main priority is just to simply get Germany straight again. And so, like a wolf wearing lamb's clothing, he hid his long-term aims. And that's why in these early years, he, as part of this pose of reasonableness, he didn't allow the Nazi Party to fully take over all aspects of German life. So the context of the events of the Night of the Little Knives are obviously part of the context of that. We've looked at the party versus the state, and how in the early years Hitler pretty much kept the old machinery of the state, staffed by conservatives, intact. So there wasn't a full sort of takeover of power, because Hitler was focused more on the short-term practical problems of destroying communism, creating confidence, creating strong government, creating law and order, and bringing about full employment. Only once the country had reached a position of strength, where the country was back to work, where the unemployment had been reduced, and where Hitler had built up the army to a position where there was no risk really of fighting a war and losing a war. Remember, Hitler learned very quickly that there was always a risk that the British, the French, and the Americans could go to war against him if they were if they were nervous about his ambitions. So the whole point in the first phase was to convince the Allies, the British, French, and the Americans, that Hitler, his foreign policy objectives were reasonable. But if it went wrong, it was important that he had a strong army, and that basically meant developing the size of the army to a point where the British, French, and Americans would not risk war. And Hitler very quickly learned that the British in particular did not want to risk war. If the British didn't want to go to war, then the French would follow the British, and America isolated on the other side of the Atlantic. Many of the American people really were not interested in getting involved in a war in Europe anyway. Not that Hitler wanted a war with the West as it was, but he had to cover all those bases. But from 1937 onward, Hitler has learned that lesson, and he's now ready from about 1937 onwards on starting to prepare for that big eastward expansion. Okay, so that's all part and parcel of understanding the next few slides. Okay, so we'll start off by looking at Schacht, Halmor Shacht, who was put in charge of running the economy in the early years 1933 to 36, and there's two parts to this video cast about Schacht. The first one looks at his deficit financing policies. Okay, so who was Halmor Shacht? Halmor Shacht, the key point is to understand is that he was not a Nazi. He was a conservative. He was one of the backers, the wealthy upper class backers who put Hitler into power in 1933. So he was part of the sort of conservative establishment. In fact, he'd been around many, many years. Go back long enough, 1923, he was the sort of financial wizard behind the scenes who sorted out the problems of the hyperinflation by creating the new currency called the Rentenmark. So what happened? Hitler was made Chancellor in January 1933. One of his first appointments was to make Schacht president of the Reichsbank. You can see that's there, the 16th of March 1933. And August 1934, notice that, the date, just very soon after the Night of the Long Knives, suddenly, to the shock of the Nazi Party, Schacht was made Minister of Economics, and that's one of the key positions in government, given to a non-Nazi. So that's why it's important to sort of view this in the context of what we said about the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler was nipping in the bud party ambitions to take over everything. He's saying very clearly, no, the party is not being allowed. We need to have order, we need to have stability, we need to channel the revolution into gradual change for the next few years. So he was a conservative, very, very experienced. He was right-wing, no doubt about it, but he was not a racist right-wing person. He certainly did not want Germany to go to war. Hitler would never have spoken to him about that. Yes, Hitler would have said, we need to make weapons, but the conversation would have been along the lines of Germany has the right to an army like any other country, so we can defend ourselves. So Schacht went along with the rearmament plans, not because he thought that Hitler's plans were to go to war for conquest in the East, but because Germany needed an army to defend herself. So what were Schacht's early policies? Now, in the 1920s, there was a great deal of debate internationally about the role that governments should take in economics. It's important to understand that, remember, that Hitler was a social Darwinist, which basically meant he believed in competition. And as a social Darwinist, Hitler believed it was essential that the government of Germany do not interfere too much in the German economy, that competition in the economy was good. Competition promotes initiative, new ideas. If there's a profit motive, then the owners of business are more likely to come up with ideas. So Hitler did not want to take away competition. He wanted to retain capitalism in Germany. This was not like communist Russia, where the economy was completely taken over by the government. Hitler wanted to steer the economy in the direction that he wanted it, but he wanted to retain capitalism. And Schacht was very much on board with that, because that fitted in with Schacht's views about the way economies should work. The other key thing is that in the 1920s there was a view that if a country the economy was stagnating, as most countries in Europe were by the early 1930s after the Great Depression, there was a debate about how do you stimulate growth of the economy. And one of the arguments, which was actually an economic theory devised by a British person called John Maynard Keynes, in the 1920s, was what we call deficit financing. And the way to stimulate economic growth was for the government to encourage, or basically to spend money that it did not have. Try to view an economy as being like a bank account. Effectively build up an overdraft. Spending creates jobs. Okay, spending money you don't have stimulates growth. Once you have growth, then the government can step in and can tax that growth and can use the taxation revenue to pay off the debts. So in the short term, you've got to incur debts, deficit financing. So that's basically what Schacht did. The government stepped in, spent money that it did not have. It ran up huge overdrafts through public investment, public works schemes. The most famous, of course, was the building of motorways. All of this worked to great effect. Also, much of that was government contracts to rearm Germany. Had to be very careful because the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany should not be rearmed. So much of that was done secretly, and it was done using money that the government did not have. Effectively, it's explained there, credit notes were issued that could be converted at a later stage into proper currency. So these were what were called MIFO bills, the creation of sort of dummy companies and false money that did not appear on the books, which had the advantage of they could not be audited by the Allies, who were keeping an eye on how Germany was spending her money. Strictly speaking, she was spending money that did not exist to fund rearmament. So all of these were ways, very creative ways, that Schacht used to stimulate economic recovery. And the final point is he did it to huge success. Unemployment did fall. By the mid-1930s, by 1936, the unemployment had fallen from, you've got the figures there, 6.1 million as they were when Hitler became Chancellor, to 1.7 million by the end of 1935. And as we move into 1936, it was still dropping, to the extent that you can pretty much say that by 1936, the economy had reached a position of real strength, in the sense that Germans had jobs, although Hitler's Germany was heavily in debt. And there's nothing new with that. Germany had been heavily in debt ever since the 1870s. That problem had continued through World War I. It was a problem in the Weimar Republic, but certainly this problem was getting worse and worse. But undoubtedly, on one level, Schacht's policies were very successful, because remember, Hitler wanted popularity, and the German people did not put him into power because they wanted war. They didn't want that. They put him into power largely because they wanted him to sort out, create law and order, to create strong government. The middle classes wanted him to crush communism, and the vast majority of Germans who were out of work wanted their jobs. And that worked. So Hitler's popularity with the German people by 1936 was very strong. And Hitler did not want to lose that. Remember, he is preparing for war, but he does not want to lose his popularity, because that is where World War I went wrong. So far, by 1936, so far so good in some ways. There's some supplementary notes there, which I won't take you through. They're part of the original lesson that I taught in class. They're from Stephen Lee's excellent book, from one of his essays about this particular period. You can pause this video cast and read those notes. And what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the second part of Schacht, which is what we call the balance of payments problem, and the new plan. Okay, so what did this amount to? Well, but basically, sort of jumping slightly ahead here, by 1936, Schacht had done a great job, no doubt about it. He'd created economic growth, and by 1936, you've got something on the edge of full employment. From the viewpoint of the German people are very happy with what Hitler has achieved. But economic growth is not always good. Economic growth creates problems in itself. And the problems that resulted from Germany's staggering economic growth between 1933 and 36, while Schacht was running the economy, reached a point by 1936 which ultimately meant that a disagreement broke out between Hitler and Schacht over where the economy should go next. And that disagreement ultimately led to Schacht being dismissed. Didn't happen suddenly. He was demoted, he was ignored. He eventually lost his position in 1938, where he became actually an active part of the opposition to Hitler. But it resulted in Schacht being dismissed and a Nazi being put in charge of the economy. And that Nazi was Hermann Goering. We'll move on to that one in a second. So what are the key points here? I'm not going to read through all of these points that you're looking at here. You can pause the video cast and play them yourself. But the key points of this, remember, economic growth is good, but it creates problems. What are those problems? First of all, economic growth creates demand. So that sort of point is developed there on the notes. It stimulates demand in different ways, but the key one is it stimulates a demand for consumer goods. Consumer goods are the type of products that ordinary people want to buy in the shops. Okay. Why did economic growth stimulate consumer demand? Because there's full employment. In 1933, there were 6 million Germans out of work. Germans were just really happy for the economy to produce enough food and houses, to keep them, keep a place to live and to keep them fed. But by 1936, nearly all Germans have got jobs. And the reason we work is that you want to be able to spend your money on things other than the basic necessities of life. So the German people wanted goods in the shops. So therefore they want the German economy to make consumer goods. So there was basically demand for consumer goods. Secondly, imagine you're a businessman. Okay, your role is to make money for yourself. You want to make your own decisions. This is not a communist state. So far, Hitler has not really interfered and told the German businessmen what they should be making. By 1936, there is full employment. What does that mean for a businessman? Okay, well, if your business is going to expand, you have got to recruit workers. If there is full employment, there's a shortage of workers. So if you're going to attract new workers to your workplace to work for you, you can only do that by making it enticing, by, for example, increasing wages. So when you've got a shortage of anything economically, when demand outstrips supply, effectively the price goes up. So the price of labour went up because there was a shortage of it. The workers were in a position where they could say, well, I will work for you, but I want more money. So the businessmen had to pay more money to get workers to work for them. If the businessmen are going to pay more money on wages, then when they sell their goods on the market, they will have to raise the prices to cover the costs of the labour. And so therefore prices start to go up. So what this basically means is the basic principle of economics is if demand outstrips supply and there was a demand for consumer goods, the market was pushing for more consumer goods, and there was a shortage of labour by 1936, then there was what we call inflationary pressure. There was a pressure on the economy that could very well result in prices rising, what we call a wage price spiral. That was Hitler's biggest fear, because what Hitler wants is to divert growth into the making of weaponry. He does not want to divert economic growth into the pockets of the workers. He wants the economy to be making weapons, not consumer goods, but at the same time, he wants to provide the workers with sufficient consumer goods so that they are happy, because Hitler craves popularity. Also, Hitler does not want wages going up. He wants to keep wages low. Also, if Germany is preparing for war, Hitler does not want the German economy to be importing and exporting abroad. If Germany is dependent on importing, and there's pressure now from the businessmen and from the German people, we want consumer goods, so the businessmen are saying, well, we're going to have to basically sell goods overseas, so we can basically buy materials from overseas, so we can make consumer goods. In other words, Germany needs to move into a traditional trading position to provide the demand for consumer goods. Well, that's all well and good, but if war breaks out and Hitler wants to go to war in the East, Hitler does not want a blockade. Hitler does not want to be dependent on essential imports from abroad, as Germany was in World War One. So here was basically the rub. Schacht basically said, we need to make consumer goods. We need to now start providing for the German people. We need to start importing essential materials so we can make consumer goods to keep the German people happy. We need to pay for imports by exporting goods, so therefore we need to start trading with other countries. And we need to increase wages so that businessmen can attract a workforce. Now, Hitler did not want any of those things. Hitler was anxious about doing all of those things. So effectively, there was a standoff between Hitler and Schacht. Now, in the short term, Schacht did find a short-term solution to this. So in 1934, Schacht, to sort of address this issue, what we call the balance of payments problem, where Germany was building up sort of like huge debt, spending money she did not have. And as Germany was reaching sort of like, with economic growth, the sort of like pressure to move into a consumer economy, what we call the new plan. So the details of the new plan are on the right there. I'm going to move to the next screen. But basically what the new plan was this. There were a group of countries in almost Germany's hinterland, Germany's back garden, Romania, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. You can see them on the map there. They were poor countries. They were developing countries. They were looking for partners to trade with, but geographically where they were, and because they were relatively poor countries, they were not really in a position where they could pick and choose trading partners. And Hitler or Schacht developed what we call the new plan, which was to make trading agreements with each of these countries, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, what we call bilateral trading agreements with one country at a time. That Germany would trade with these countries on a special arrangement. Much of the arrangements would simply be, we will not deal with money directly, we will simply barter goods. We will provide what you need, you will provide us with essential raw materials or low quality consumer goods. These countries sort of like did produce consumer goods. They weren't good quality, but effectively Germany would buy consumer goods from these countries that would then appear on the German market. So in a sense, that was a short-term solution that was introduced by Schacht to kind of like resolve that problem in the short term. It did put on the German market. It did provide a means of satisfying consumer demand in the short term, and it also saved vital foreign currency. Hitler needed to preserve as much money as he could for essential imports, which were needed for rearmament, by making these trading agreements where foreign currency was not actually used, trade was just done directly using German marks. Effectively, that meant that foreign currency was preserved for absolutely essential items, that Germany needed in order to begin to rearm. So that was the new plan. It was a short-term solution, and it was part of Schacht's way round that problem. But in the end, as the economy grew and grew and grew, it reached a position by 1936 where a new approach was needed. Supplementary notes from Stephen Lee there. Read through those. They explain many of the points that I've just talked you through. I think it's worthwhile just looking at that sort of final point there. Number 3, in 1936 there was increased demand from those two conflicting areas, so full employment, but also the pressure for weapons. So we've developed that one. And there's Hitler's dilemma, was that the economy could not produce both guns and butter. It's a very common phrase, it was used at the time, without causing inflation, which would increase the balance of payments problem. And there's the point. Schacht, because he was a traditional economist, now his time was up. He wasn't in tune with Hitler's long-term plans to reduce, what Schacht wanted was to reduce arms expenditure for the time being, because Schacht, in his mind, rearmament was not about aggressive expansion, it was about defence. And what Schacht wanted to do was start to export abroad to generate foreign exchange. That solution was unacceptable to Hitler, who's now wanting to step up the pace to rearm immediately, and another solution needed to be found, which leads to the fall of Schacht and a Nazi being put in charge of running the German economy. And that Nazi was Hermann Goering. And in September 1936, a key moment in the history of Nazi Germany, the four-year plan was announced. So, what was the four-year plan? Take a look directly at these points. The German economy was placed now under the direction of a Nazi, Hermann Goering, and the remit was very simple. We've now waited long enough. We've been in power for 4 years. We've reached that stage where we need to move towards full fascism. The party must now start taking over the key areas of policy. And in terms of the economy, we need to now step up the pace of rearmament, starting to prepare for that massive war to invade in the East. And the target was set to Goering to have the German economy ready within 4 years. Now, strictly speaking, that would have been 1940. We now, as historians, look at the four-year plan, and although it was very successful in many ways, certainly it did not achieve its objectives, and that's why realistically we say that for Germany to launch that big invasion for living space, 1940 was not the date, and realistically, as we move towards the end of the 1930s, that sort of key date had moved to somewhere in the mid-1940s. Big debate amongst historians about that particular objective. But the key point is that Schacht had to be dismissed. Okay, Schacht, remember, was a traditional financier. He says we're building up debts. We've got to now take a breather. We've got to pay off our debts. We can only do that by reverting back to a trading economy with other countries so that we can start paying off our debts. Hitler's not that way of thinking. Neither was Goering. It is very much sort of like similar to if you think of a traditional bank account. If your parents are spending on their credit card, all well and good up to a point, but eventually the bank will step in and say, no, you've got to basically start balancing your budget, and you can't build up an overdraft anymore. Well, the Nazis were not prepared to think that way. Goering was not prepared to think that way. That's just going to delay the whole process of preparing for war. And a bit like somebody who's got an overdraft, if they're not prepared to listen to the bank, what do? They rob the bank. The Nazis, quite similar. Goering's attitude was, well, the equivalent of robbing the bank was basically invading a country. And that, of course, was the plan, wasn't it? The plan was to prepare for war, to conquer other countries. So from Goering's point of view, and from Hitler's point of of view, they're not really interested in this argument about building up, about balancing the books, because the Nazis are bandits, they're gangsters, they're robbers. They will carry on building up an overdraft so that the country is ready for war. And then when Germany launches the war, they will balance the books by what we call a plunder economy, by looting and pillaging and taking the wealth of other countries to pay off the debts that they have accumulated. So really, Hitler is not interested in that. He wants guns, not butter, using that sort of analogy. Now, Goering, his view was, well, if we're going to prepare for war, that's my brief, okay, so we have to basically forego the benefits of consumer products for the short term. And so that was really what the 4-year plan was about. We need to prepare for war as quickly as possible. It will put pressure on the people. But because the economy will not be producing consumer goods. That worried Hitler. Hitler did not entirely want to move away from consumer production because that would damage his popularity. But the sort of thinking was, well, if we start conquering neighbouring countries, and remember in 1938 Austria was absorbed into Germany, and then the Sudetenland was absorbed into Germany, and Hitler's argument was to the Allies that is a rightful thing, it is part of the revision of the Treaty of Versailles, and that was successfully achieved to some extent. Absorbing the assets of those areas as they were absorbed was a way of addressing the problem of consumer demand. But there was always a big risk during this phase of massive preparation for war, making weapons, not consumer goods, that it was going to put additional pressure on the German people. And indeed it did, because wages were repressed. Remember, Hitler did not want to create inflation, so wages were repressed, wage increases were restricted, consumer spending was controlled. But always in the sights was, once we start absorbing and conquering nations, we will then be able to give back to the people. Another key feature of the 4-year plan was this issue of we don't want to be dependent on essential imports. We can't be a traditional country trading and buying goods abroad, because when war breaks out, trade stops. And we learned from World War I that if we are at war, there could very well be a blockade of Germany, in which case we won't have access to those essential imports from abroad. And there were certain things that Germany could not produce naturally. So, for example, rubber, for example, oil. Germany did not have those natural supplies in her land. So Goering's solution as part of the 4-year plan was what we call producing ersatz materials. Ersatz materials are basically synthetic substitutes. They are artificial raw materials that are manufactured in factories, such as synthetic rubber, petrol and oil. That became a priority. That meant that Germany had to put a lot of money into scientific research, to produce this. To a large extent they were very successful, but it was horribly expensive, so that again increased the balance of payments problem. So it was a key part of the 4-year plan, and that of course again diverted essential resources away from consumer goods. So by the late 1930s, Germany, certainly the 4-year plan was to some extent successful. Germany was well on the way towards building up a strong army. Hitler has learned that the British are not prepared to really fight wars, so Hitler's increasingly confident by the late 1930s that Germany can take that risk of eastward expansion without ending up at war with Britain. He got away with it with Austria in 1938, he got away with it with Czechoslovakia, also late 1938 and early 1939. But as we move into 1939, the mood of the German people was increasingly repressed. They've seen their wages held down, there's little consumer goods in the shops. Increasingly, their working hours have been increased because Hitler needs more a workforce for rearmament, and therefore, without extra workers, he's increasing workers' pay. So Hitler's got a sense of urgency. We need to launch this invasion so we can conquer territory, so we can plunder the economies of these territory, so we can take the pressure off the German people. So in a sense, there was pressure on Hitler to launch the war sooner than Germany was ready to fight that war. Supplementary notes from Lee. Have a look through those, read those yourself. They make similar points. It's always good to get this from two different perspectives. That's the end of this podcast. I hope that was useful to you. It's quite a complex topic, but it's a very interesting one. And certainly if you've got your head around the principles and the details, it is a good one to write essays about in the examination. Thank you very much.